hope you're doing well, and welcome to the first episode of Why Play Music. I'm your host, Steve Burke. I'm coming to you from sunny Brooklyn, New York. One of my favorite things about being a bass player is that I get to play with interesting musicians across many genres of music. I'm fascinated by artists and their processes, and through music, I've been fortunate enough to meet hundreds of thoughtful, passionate, and talented people. Music attracts people for all different reasons, but one thing that unites us is that we all have some deep, deep love for this art form. Making a living as a musician in the 21st century is not easy, and what fascinates me is hearing about why musicians choose to persist, what sustains them, and where their passion to play comes from. On this show, I'll talk to musicians, people I look up to, people I have learned from, and try to suss out the answer to this question: why play music? The format of the show is like this. First, my guest and I will perform a piece of music together. Then we have a conversation. Then we play another piece of music. Then we chat some more. And we close out the show with one final piece of music. Today's guest is Bobby Spellman. Bobby's a jazz trumpet player, composer, educator, and music theorist from Queens. Bobby's music stretches from the hard-hitting, funky brass band music of his Dingo street band to the lush and richly layered swing music of his Revenge of the Cool Nonnet. Bobby and I have played together in his free fusion group, the Voodoo Club. In addition to his own creative projects, Bobby stays busy as a sideman, playing trumpet with groups such as the Temptations, the Either Orchestra, and the Ed Palermo Big Band. Bobby's a fascinating and dynamic character, and once you hear his thoughts on music and his thoughts on life, I think you'll agree. All of the pieces performed in this show were written by Bobby Spellman, with the exception of the final piece, which was composed on the fly by the two of us. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Bobby Spellman. All right.
Is that cool? Or is this comfortable? Whatever.
That's cool.
I don't have to be too. Maybe I'm too close to it.
I think closer is okay.
Yeah, you want to get that deep, that sweet depth to my voice. Okay.
All right. So Bobby Spellman, thanks for being on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being the very first guest here.
Anytime. I'm proud to be the first guest.
So we've been talking. So you've been here for a little while today, and we were rehearsing those tunes. So first of all, can you tell us about yourself?
Maybe. Let's see. I'm a trumpet player.
Uh-huh.
I'm a composer. I'm an improviser. I'm a human being. I'm a multifaceted character.
You're a podcast host.
I am a podcast host, although I don't think of myself as that. But I do think of myself as somebody who's curious enough about the music to seek out information from other people and to try to share that information. Being a podcast host, in my mind, is more about being an educator and just being the liaison between people who are like masters of the craft and people who are interested in learning it. But the host part is kind of funny. It's new to me a little bit, but
I think that's interesting because, I mean, you're in a niche. Like, we're talking about music, but you're talking even more niche than just the world of musicians. You're talking about jazz musicians.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about what it's like being in such a small niche, what it's like, sort of what your approach is in trying to bring this information out into the world?
Sure. Well, jazz is an interesting world because it's where I've been my entire life. It's what I know the best. So I guess it's niche, but it's interesting because all of my heroes are jazz musicians. So like, it's kind of funny, you know, if I was like a rock music, if I was like a serious rock musician, which I'm a rock musician sometimes, but if that was my main focus, if I'm trying to get like, you know, like Flea on the line or something to do my show or something, it'd be kind of hard to do. But it's very often I'm surprised that, like, you know, if you're in the jazz world, you can show up to a show, people that are the highest level musicians in the world, and afterwards you can just go talk to them and hang out with them, you know? I don't know if that's good or bad. Like, it's not, you know, I'd love if there was a greater audience for like this style of music or whatever, this whole history of the music. But, you know, I mean, there's a funny thing about being in that niche world and that you have access to all these people that are like the masters of their craft. But I don't think of it as anything in particular. You know what I mean? To me, like, these people are just like I would rather hang out with, you know, somebody like, I don't know, certain people, let's say in the jazz world, than I would with certain people, I don't know, like super famous people or whatever.
Sure.
You know what I mean? That's not interesting to me. What's interesting to me is the music itself.
What do you find so captivating about jazz?
I think the thing that drives me towards it is the expression of the humanity of the individual. So the fact that you can listen to Dexter Gordon or Coltrane or, you know, I mean, pick your favorite saxophone player, play Body and Soul, and it's the same tune and the same changes and the same melody and everything, and yet every person is going to bring their own individuality to it. And not only their individuality, but the sort of collective experience of the rhythm section that they're playing with, the other musicians they're playing with, the other horn players, you know, that all is so unique to each individual performance.
Right.
And it's really fascinating to be able to hear the way that people, you know, bring their own personality to the music. And furthermore, it's a kind of style of music that really incorporates everything that I love about music, in the sense that it is a very intellectual music, but it's also got this deep history of the sort of underlying funkiness of the music. Like, it's like this combination of folk music, and then it was passed down through time, you know, by ear up until, you know, it sort of became codified in whatever it was, the 70s or something like that in music school. But it really comes from that folk tradition, and yet at the same time it has this like super heavy intellectual side to it. So it's both things at once, and it covers so much ground. Like, if you listen to Charles Mingus, you get that roots blues, like, you know, all of that gospel stuff, and everything is in there that's just roots, like folk music, and yet at the same time you're dealing with a guy who's clearly a genius. You know what I mean? He can bring all these other sort of elements to this music that you wouldn't otherwise expect, maybe. It's always surprising. It never gets old. You know what I mean?
And there's a rawness to that music that kind of comes from like an expression, like that it's not, we're only here to do something intellectual. We're also here to sort of bare our souls a little bit, to kind of be out here on the stage doing something that's real and communicative. You're speaking to the other musicians and you're talking about some real stuff. You know, like some music I think can be a little bit stuffy. It can be a little bit too academic. But one thing that I've always admired about you is that you always seem to bridge the line between somebody who's very academic and very learned in music, but you're also passionate about, as you said, the folk aspect of the music, the ways in which it was birthed, its connection to the blues, and I've heard you use the word spiritual to describe jazz before too.
Sounds probable. Sounds like something I would say. Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Well, and I'll tell you, part of it too is that I feel like the way that we learn this music now is very academic. Mm-hmm. Very often people will learn jazz in school, in high school or whatever, in their jazz program, and there's these rules that you're supposed to follow, and it's sort of this academic codified approach, and then you get into college and you learn it from there and all this other stuff. But growing up, I just liked the music. I was I had the benefit of having a great jazz teacher in high school, but even, at the same time, I was driving around with my friends and we were listening to Art Blakey records. We weren't listening to, it wasn't like we were listening to pop records or rock records and then we like learned jazz as an academic exercise. Mm-hmm. We would be like driving through town and like singing the solos to these like Freddie Hubbard solos or whatever, like to these Art Blakey tracks or whatever, like, or we would go into Boston all the time and see the Fringe play, in high school, and I was getting my mind blown, but I wasn't going in with my pencil and my notebook and being like, what is it, what's going on here? It was like punk rock. It was like our punk rock. You know what I mean? And my dad, had me, I was listening to, like, when I first heard Benny Goodman do Sing, Sing, Sing or whatever, like that was like, the hairs stood up on the back of my neck. I was like, this is it. This is amazing, but I didn't go into it like I'm supposed to learn this because it's like I'm going to be smarter for it, or I can, this is some path in music where I can have some academic approach to it. But the academic side comes from just that I'm just inquisitive in that way. I just have that. I like digging down to try to find why something works. But the music itself always to me has this underlying, like, I just love the music. It's just is like, to me is that's my music. It's like it's moving. You know what I mean?
I think that's an interesting phrase that you said, that it's your punk music, because it almost sounds like it served some sort of purpose for you as a kid. Like it wasn't just the music that your teacher turned you on to. It also served some sort of purpose of, what's the purpose of punk music? Maybe to find your identity, maybe to be different from the authority figures, maybe to sort of cut out on your own and say, hey, this is for me. This is what I like, and I don't care that the rest of society doesn't like it. This is me. In what way was it your punk music, and what exactly does that mean to you?
Well, that's probably a pretty good way to put it. I don't know. I mean, in my mind, I think what I mean by that is that there's a visceral emotional response to it, more than it was definitional. I'm sure that it did define me in a sense. I mean, I'm sure that to some degree, your favorite music, your favorite band, whatever it happens to be, is always, especially when you're a teenager, probably, is like very reflective of the way that, of your personality and stuff like that. And we find ourselves or something. I don't know. I don't know if I was really thinking about that so much as it was just like, this is the music that I was just like compelled by more than anything. You know what I mean? But it didn't matter that it was like otherwise considered academic or niche music, or it didn't matter to me that none of my friends, some of my friends weren't into it or whatever. Like but it's just that it was that music that reached me and was like, this was the stuff that I was like, yeah, you know what I mean? This is the stuff that was like, get me riled up, in the same way that you'd be in like a mosh pit or whatever. Like if there was a mosh pit at a bebop show, I'd for sure be like throwing bows, you know what I mean? I'd be out there just like go nuts. So I don't know. I don't exactly know, but like, I think it's just the raw emotional thing rather than it being as a distinction from being this like academic exercise that sometimes it can, I would say, unfortunately become.
That you had that emotional connection to it, that it was something that wasn't just something that you thought about and sat there quietly, but something that made you excited and caused an emotional response. And that seems to be this sort of spirit that you've taken to things like the Dingo Neck, which is your brass band. Could you talk a little bit about the Dingo Neck band and what the spirit of that group is? Like what function does that serve for you?
Sure. That's a good question. So that band started when we were in Boston. Actually, it's kind of an interesting story. So we started that band because we had this gig at a place called the Outpost, which I don't think it exists anymore, but it's like this very small art gallery space
In Cambridge?
In Cambridge, yes. And I think I just gotten out of grad school, and we had this gig set up, and I forget what it was, but it just fell through. Whatever, the guys in the band couldn't make it. So we but one of us was supposed to cancel the gig, but never canceled the gig. So I didn't want to be like, so the gig was coming up, and I was like, oh, we canceled this, right? And I was like, oh no. So I had to put something together to do it. So for a while, I wanted to put together a band that incorporated, I think at the time I was thinking about like trad jazz, like hot fives, hot sevens. I was listening to a lot of old Louis Armstrong recordings, but I was also listening to, at the same time, a lot of Ethio jazz, like Mulatu Estatke, and like all this, like there's a great series of recordings called the Ethio Peaks. And so I was listening to a lot of Ethiopian music and a lot of old trad jazz stuff. And I was like, oh, okay. There were these musicians that I wanted to play with. I was like, let's put a band together and just play some like weird, whatever music we come up with, just because it was something to do on the fly. So from that, we got a residency at the Middle East Corner in Cambridge, and we played every other week on Monday nights. And we would try out these different things. So like sometimes we'd play cover tunes, and other times we would play just straight up like, strutting with some barbecue, like the old Louis Armstrong record, tunes and stuff like that. And other times we'd be playing like Ethio jazz stuff or whatever. And it sort of congealed into this one thing. And we did an album at one point. But when I moved to New York, I wanted to embrace it. That group was like a many things at once. It was like a jazz group, and it was sort of free improvisation, and it was a brass band. But it was too many things. So when I moved to New York, we consolidated it and really brought out the brass band element of it. It became it was sort of always a little funky, but it became like we really embraced the funky side of it. So for a while, that band was just a catch-all of everything, but then it became the Dingo. And that's like, what I like about that is that it's a very versatile band in that we can play on stage, and it can be an electric thing. We can play rock clubs, and we've done it many times. Or if somebody's like, we just need somebody to set up on the floor and play on the fly, or like play in the park, or for before the pandemic, we were playing as part of the Music Under New York program, playing in the subways, which is great for that because you can just set up and play wherever you want.
No
it's tuba. The band
amplification.
band's 2 saxophones, trumpet, tuba, and drum set at this point, although it's gone through a couple of different iterations. So to me, that band is like the most sort of free-flowing band it can be and still have this funky underlying groove to it. So we always want people to be dancing, but I don't want to dispense with the cerebral side. So I'm trying to capture that balance.
That there's something of substance in there. It's not just sort of plain funk music, brass music that's been done. There's this Ethio jazz connection. There's, your more academic, interesting changes, like some deeper stuff, harmonies, like
totally
things like that.
And a lot of that music was written as experiments, and experiments in different combinations of modes and things like that. But I always want the underlying thing is like, if we play a show, I want people to be dancing,
right.
But I want the people who want to be dancing, and then I'm always my least favorite musician in the audience. Like if I saw myself in the audience, I'd be like, I hate that guy. Why isn't he not dancing? Because I'd be the guy in the back by the bar, like just checking out the music, But I want the music to be applicable to both the people who want to dance and who may not know anything about music or anything, jazz or anything. Sure. And also the people who are like, oh, what is it? What's going on here?
Yeah, there's something to this.
Yeah. So there's a lot of elements to that, but there's actually a lot built into it that is kind of free improvisation, but it always has that funky underlying thing. And like, I've tried to use it as an opportunity, basically in many instances, to just say, let me take 2 styles of music that I really love that don't belong together at all, and see if I can fuse them into one thing, so that you'd be like, what is this? Mm-hmm. But it's funny because to me, it's kind of like I don't know. It's a little bit punk rock, but other people it's like, okay, so some people will come to see that band and be like, oh, it's a jazz band. Like I've had people be like, oh, I haven't seen a jazz band in a while. I'm like, yeah, I guess it's a jazz band. But jazz people would come to it and be like, oh, this is like a weird brass band or whatever. You know what I mean? Like it means different things to different people. But sure. It's been a lot of fun. So we put out a record in 2017 on Accurate Records called Primal Economics. And then we're about to start putting together a new record with that band.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
So could you tell me a little bit about what brought you to New York?
Sure.
When did you move to New York?
I moved to New York in 2014.
From Boston?
From Boston.
Okay.
Yep. So I'm for those who don't know, I'm from Boston originally, the Boston area, the greater Boston area, and I went to undergrad, blah blah blah, did that whole thing, and then went back to Boston to go to New England Conservatory. And then from there, I stayed in Boston for a couple of years and played music and taught and everything like that. And the two things that brought me to New York are, one, I wasn't sure if I wanted to move to New York. My teacher at NEC, John McNeil, told me, he said, you can be a creative musician anywhere. But if you want to be a musician on the world stage, if you want to be a jazz musician on the world stage, you probably should be in New York. Now, I don't know if that holds true now, but that was always kind of in the back of my mind. Like, I can always be a creative musician anywhere, and I think I'd be happy being creative no matter where I ended up. But there are two things that drove me to New York. One, I don't know if this is good or not, but this is true, is when I would talk to my friends from NEC who had moved to New York, whenever they came back to Boston, they were like, oh, these are all the things I was doing in New York. I'm like, man, I should be there. I should be doing that.
A lot going on.
It was like a little jealousy, you know what I mean? But jealousy is kind of bad, but if it sometimes jealousy will teach you, like, this is what I want. I didn't really, like, subconsciously, this is what I really want.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I really want to do that, even if I'm not committed to it yet. And then the other thing is my wife, Emily, now my wife, you know Emily. She is into theater. She's a pit musician. Broadway shows and things of that nature. And she really loves that. That's always been her dream, is to be a performer on Broadway. So for her, this is the spot. So that pushed me. I think I probably would have been here anyway. I think about it sometimes, but like, she also drove me to come down here because that's the spot. She needs a specific place. I can be a creative musician anywhere, but there's no Broadway in, Lubbock or whatever. No offense to Lubbock, but it's just a different environment. You know what I mean?
Scene.
It's a different scene. Yeah. So there's a part of me that came because of, I just wanted to be a part of that music. I mean, there's no ceiling here. That's the thing about New York, is that there's no limit to what you can do.
Right.
Now it's expensive.
It's a tough game to play.
Yeah, it is. It sure is. Because everybody, I mean, you could show up on a gig and the other people in the section are like famous or whatever.
Yeah.
You can have like, it's a spot.
And that's what I always think about too. Or when people ask me about living in New York, it's like, there's a lot of opportunity, as everybody knows, and everybody also knows this is where the baddest musicians in the world are,
Yeah.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's like, yes, you're competing against everybody, but there's way more to compete for. There's all
100%.
sorts. And if you're somebody who occupies sort of a niche, or you do something that's kind of unique, New York, I think, is a place that can really bring that out. Like, for example, your Dingo Neck group and your other group, the Nonnet, to be able to put together that kind of music with that caliber of musicians that you have, to be able to rehearse somewhat regularly. I mean, maybe it's possible in Boston, but I think your pool of musicians is going to be a lot smaller than it is here in New York. Like, here you have access to just such a huge pool of musicians to make something like that creative project happen.
Definitely. And I certainly wouldn't dismiss any particular place, because I can put together a band in Boston and it's going to be great. But it is true that you could call, you can put together a big band easily in New York, and your ninth call trombone player is going to be killing. Like, everybody's going to crush. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like, there is an amazing, and that's true too. Like, all right, here's another example. Let me just say this before I get in any hot water, okay? Is I love the Boston music scene.
Same.
I grew up in that environment. There's an element to it that is unique. It's not, this is like a small New York. It's like, has its own character that I think comes from like a lot of different things. All the different scenes have different places, but like in the jazz world in particular, you have like Jackie Byard and you have like George Russell and all these people who were floating around for a long time that created this, Makonda, Ken McIntyre, all these different people that, and then of course like the Either Orchestra and the Fringe and all these people that are still there, of course, that create this particular environment. So no disrespect to Boston. I love the Boston music scene. That said, there is an element to being in New York that is like, there's so many, there's just so many people here that can all play that it's like, you're surrounded constantly by. Oh, well, the other thing too is that imagine this. This is what I'm really going for here. There are more jazz clubs in the West Village than there are in all of Massachusetts. There might be more jazz clubs in the West Village than there are in New England, but like certainly in Boston, even now, like so many of these places are going under all the time. Like Riles just, last year or whatever went under.
Bull McCabe's.
Say what?
Bull McCabe's is gone too. Not a jazz club, but
right.
a legendary club.
But all these places, and things will come back to replace them. But New York, even though you do have a lot of competition, there's a ton of opportunity.
Right.
You can play every night.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? It's a place where you could be. I know people who are professional trombonists. That's what they do. They wake up in the morning and they hang out until they have to play trombone at night. In Boston, it's hard to do that. You can be a professional trombone teacher who plays the trombone at a professional level, but it's hard to be. But here, there's the opportunity to do anything in a sense.
Sure, but the stakes are also higher. I mean, it's harder to make a living here. There's more opportunity, but it's a tough grind. And I think like that would bring me to kind of the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is what is it about music that keeps you in music? It's a tough game to play. It's a tough thing to be in New York, going after the trumpet, shedding the trumpet constantly. I know you do a lot of work to keep up your chops. It's an instrument that you just have to keep maintaining.
Yeah.
And that's all time that you could spend upping the quality of your life. There's a lot of opportunity here for people who aren't musicians. I mean, there's a lot of money here. There's a lot of potential to improve your quality of life. What is it about music? Like what sustains you when you have other options?
Yeah. I think about that a lot because it is the musical life is not an easy one.
Right.
I mean, it can be very gratifying and it can be a lot of fun, but there's no way around just hustling constantly. And that's the thing about New York is you can't wing it. Like you have to be hustling. You got to be out playing music with people and like starting groups and booking gigs, and there's no rest in that respect. And I think a lot of artists have that thing where there's like that little guy on your shoulder that when you like you take a day off or something, he's like, shouldn't you be doing something for shouldn't you be practicing or whatever? And it's like a little chaotic. And other people's lives tend to be a little bit, even if it's harder, when you wake up in the morning that you have a job and that you're going to get paid a salary or whatever. Yeah. The music thing to me it's a very interesting question, Steve. And I realize that you're trying to uncover the mystery of that in this kind of an operation. But part of it, I think, is mystical. I feel like music is this ethereal thing that we all share. It's not something like food or shelter or clothing that we need for practical reasons. And yet it's something that exists in all cultures throughout all of time. It's something that we all share, and it transcends the boundaries of human culture and the differences between people and the sort of petty disagreements that we might have with other people or other groups of people. And people can be united through music without knowing why. I couldn't really tell you what music does, but I know how it feels, and I know that feeling is something that is inherent in us. It's so deep. It's like really, really deep, And there's always been a need for musicians and a need for music, and there's always been a need for, even nowadays, like, every couple of years, people are like spelling the doom of the music industry and music in general or whatever because technology changes or whatever. But there's just no substitute for being in a room with other people creating music in real time.
Yeah.
So the thing that drives me forward is it's almost like the way that I think about it is if you were put in solitary confinement and couldn't talk to people, you would go crazy. And I feel as though it's the same thing with music. It's at this point, it's not even like I'm like overflowing with musical creativity or something, or like I don't have any aspirations exactly that like it's not like, oh, I'm doing this so that I can be, rich and famous or whatever. It's like I have to do it. It's like every day I wake up and all I want to do is just write music, and I don't even know why sometimes. And a lot of the time it's not even fun. Like it's not fun like 90% of the time. It's like a grind most of the time.
Yeah.
But every once in a while I'll be writing a piece of music. I'll be writing an arrangement, and it's like you enter a different realm, and then it's like this transcendent experience. Or playing on stage with people. I was playing when we hit June this last year. There were like 2 weeks in between when like basically everybody was vaccinated and the Delta variant scared everybody back into their holes. And we were able to just play music like it was 2019 again or whatever. And we were playing with the Dingo. We played at a place called Wild Birds, which is in sort of the Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights area. And we were playing this music, and it was a packed house. It was crazy. And a lot of people were just there. Most people I don't think they were there to see us. They were just there because they were thirsty for music. And you could tell. Like they just were needed live music. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was like if you were, if you only got to eat crackers for a year and somebody's like, here's a filet mignon or something. Like people just wanted, and I felt like I was going to float off the bandstand. Like I was just the energy in the room. Like we're playing covers of, like we do a cover of Walk on the Wild Side, and they're singing the lyrics of the song back at us. It's a brass band. There's no vocals. You know what I mean? And those moments are just like, there's something going on here that's like magical, but it's not easy to describe. And I'm a fairly analytical guy. So I would love to be able to describe why we need it like that, why music, but there's so many things that are professions that you can say like, oh, it's great. If you're a car mechanic, people need their cars fixed. If you can fix their cars, you're really doing a big service to people because they need to get to work and they need to do all this other stuff. But music is this funny world because sometimes it feels like self-indulgent, right, in the sense that you're working on, especially if you're a creative musician, you're working on your own music a lot of the time. And it's like, what are we doing here? But in the times when it all comes together and it makes sense, it's like, this is a uniquely human experience that needs to be, I don't want to say preserved, but maintained. It needs to be fed and cultivated and watered. And like people need to be there to continue to push the music forward because it's like an essential part of what it is to be a human being.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you need a car mechanic to fix your car because you need a car to go to places, right? You need music. You need musicians to play music because you need music. And there's no real definition. That's where it kind of breaks down. Like with the car, you need a car mechanic to fix your car so you can go to this place to earn money, to buy food, whatever. There's some end result. But with music, there isn't necessarily that end result that everybody can agree on. I think there are times, like you said, where you're just floating off the bandstand, where it's this really fulfilling experience, which has clearly sustained you over the last few months. It's something you think about. It's something that you remember. You'll probably remember those moments and many of these other moments playing live for the rest of your life. It sticks with you and it changes you. And I think every musician can relate to that. And certainly every big music fan can relate to those moments, standing in a crowd of people. And it's like you're no longer you. It's like the boundaries between you and the rest of the people sort of disappear. You're sort of one with the human race. I think music brings that out in people as sort of connection. And I think we need that connection.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. And it's kind of interesting actually, because I'd just have to think much more on this, but like, it's this funny thing where it brings us together and yet at the same time it allows us to be ourselves. It's two things at once. It's like the individual, it's like any band, you know what I mean? It's like, let's take like, I don't know, the Miles Davis band in the 50s or whatever. Like all those people, Miles Davis, Coltrane, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, Philly Joe Jones, those people are like fiercely individual. And yet that band became its own thing because of their connection, because of them playing in a group. There's probably something to be said for that in terms of being an audience too. Like it brings all these people together, but it allows you to be yourself. At the same time, you can be a part of this greater whole, which there's probably some deeper human element to that too. I'm not a anthropologist, so I can't speak to it, but there's got to be something there. 'Cause we keep doing it, man. We keep subjecting ourselves to this the chaos of the life of a musician.
Yeah.
The dangers and the uncertainty. There's got to be a reason for it.
Yeah. And that's what the show's about. That's what I'm trying to find out. And that's what I'm curious about with you. Why do you play music? And just trying to figure out what is it that makes you do this thing that in so many ways is so difficult. It's one of the most difficult paths, not just to become a professional musician, but it can be expensive if playing music is your hobby, which it is for many, many people. It's an expensive hobby. If you love music and you love live music, it's a lot of work to travel to festivals, to travel to shows, to buy tickets. What is it? What is it for each of us? And
Mm-hmm.
I think the answer to that question is interesting because we each have kind of a different approach to it.
Sure.
Speaking of music, do you want to play a tune?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Yep. And these sound good. I hope these recordings sound good.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, what the fuck do I care what this guy has to say? He's flooding these notes, man.
Okay, we're back.
We're
That was
back.
fun. Played a blues. Now, we played a tango, played a blues, but you're an amazing composer, and your Nonnet material is just ridiculous. So
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about what your process is for writing that music.
Okay.
Yeah. Could you just talk a little bit about what it's actually like to write music for a 9-piece band in the style of this legendary band? Like, where does this music come from, and what's your creative process like for producing it?
Sure. So let me go back. So I've got a Nonnet we released an album in 2020 on Sunnyside Records called Revenge of the Cool.
Mm-hmm.
And it's based on the instrumentation from Miles Davis's Birth of the Cool Nonnet. And I started the band when I was in grad school at NEC. And that music has always been... But I started working on it when I was an undergrad. And I started working on it even before that, because the first 2 CDs I bought with my own money, you know, it's like I was in ninth grade or something like that, and I like saved up for music, and I went to Dino Records in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and I bought 2 CDs. I bought one that was an old compilation of like late 40s Dizzy Gillespie things. It was both his small group and his big band, called Dizzier and Dizzier, and the other one was Birth of the Cool. Mm. And since then, that music has always been floating around my head. I don't know what it is about that recording or about that band or about any of that stuff, but it's just like, it's like a part of my soul. So for a long time, I just wanted to put together a band to play that music because I wanted to be in the middle of it. I don't know if I had any motivation other than that. I don't think that I wasn't trying to be, I didn't want to be like, oh, I'm going to recreate this. It's not recreatable. It just is good on its own. You know what I'm saying? I'm not going to play a better solo than Miles Davis played, or, you know, I'm not going to play a better solo than Jerry Mulligan or something. But, like, I just wanted to be in the middle of that music. And once I put the band together, I wanted to start writing some music for it. And that's varied a lot. My intent is not to write music in the style of Gil Evans. But, of course, some of that comes through because I've spent a lot of time with that music. So, but I don't want to be derivative. I don't want this to be like Miles Davis Nonnet Part 2, even though I called it Revenge of the Cool. So it's my bad, whatever.
But it's not. I mean, it has this other quality to it. Your free jazz influence comes through. The blues influence comes through. Not that music isn't influenced by the blues, but there's a rawness to it that maybe wasn't the intent with that Gil Evans. Although you could speak about that. You know what?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that they definitely. I mean, I would have to be there. Of course, they're all jazz musicians, and they all had blues influence. But certainly, it did have this kind of like if you listen to Gil Evans' arrangement of Moon Dreams, there is a very like contemporary classical kind of almost 12-tone approach to the end of that music. Like they were definitely incorporate the French horn and these various colors to it. You know, and they talked about like Impressionism and Debussy and all this stuff. So I don't know to what degree that was specifically their influence or whatever, but there are certain things that go on in that music that are, a little different than what you would get from the blues or whatever. But certainly there's an element, there's all that, this jazz on it swings like crazy, this whole thing. But I wanted to try to incorporate my various influences. I felt a little bad at times trying to get because I like kind of crazy, sometimes rough around the edges music. So, but I want to feel comfortable incorporating that into the band, and certainly the free music a lot of the time. One of the things that, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but everybody that I call to play in the band has to be able to play inside and outside. It has to be. That's the requirement for playing in the band, is that you can comfortably play, read and play with a beautiful tone and play, very structured and inside and beautiful harmonies and things of that nature. But when called, you can wander freely into the forest and explore the unknown.
And that seems to exclude quite a few musicians, especially with that instrumentation, right? Is there French horn in that group, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to find a French horn player who is very interested in this type of music. Is that hard to find, or?
Well, again, it brings us back to the beauty of being in New
Yeah.
York. Although I did find there were some really great French horn players that played in the band back in Boston. But there are two people that play. Our regular French hornist is Kyra Sims, and she does some improvisation, but she really understands the music, and she can swing, and she really has a beautiful sound.
Yeah.
And fills in that. Really does an amazing job with that role. And there's a guy named Justin Mullins who plays with us regularly. Both of them are on the album. I was fortunate to be able to get both of them on the album. And Justin is an improviser, and he'll play like, actually the first time he played with the band, we would do Move, which for those people familiar with the album is, it's a pretty fast swing tune. But I would take it at just like preposterous, blistering fast. I would just take it so fast. It was ridiculous, but it was fun. You're just like, take it to the limit. And I think I was kind of messing with this guy. I was just like, all right, guy. All right, French horn guy. Here he can improvise. Like, go for it. And he kicked it out the gate like crazy, man. And he could just play. I mean, he can play all that bebop stuff. So there are people who can do it. There's a lot of people in town. There's, Vincent Chansey plays, improvises French horn. There's a lot of people that do it, but it is, it's not easy to find for sure.
Sure. Yeah.
But in New York, it's a little easier than it might.
So can you talk a little bit about your creative process for writing that material? Like what is a day like when you're actually composing that music? How do you do it? You do it on the piano? Do you do it on the horn?
I write everything on piano. I've never written anything on trumpet. And for the reason that I don't want anything to be too trumpety. It may be a benefit to write on trumpet because I could get my ideas out more quickly. I write fairly slowly. But I want to be intentional about what I'm doing. I don't want to do anything that's just like, oh, this is like something that I might play, just play as an improviser or whatever. But I have to force myself into a writing routine. I have ideas that I will sketch or write down or sing into my phone. But the only way to turn that into music is if I say, I will write every day from this time to this time. So from 10 to noon, for example. When I was doing the Nonnet record, this is the way that I did it. Is I said from 10 to noon, I write. And there's a great book called The War of Art. And he talks about that, the idea that, you're battling what he calls the resistance, but it's the, not wanting to do, your own self sabotage or whatever. But it's the idea that if you win every time you sit down to just write, and you might not get anything. I might spend an entire day, not a whole day, but like all of my writing time just trying to get out like 4 bars of music or the next day I might write and it could be like a whole tune. Arranging it is a little bit, it's almost like the composing part versus the arranging part. I'm always thinking of the arrangement while I'm composing, and I usually write for a group rather than just writing pieces. I've arranged pieces for the Nonnet that I wrote for other groups. One of the piece, the tango, actually, I originally wrote for the previous incarnation of the Dingo, and then that no longer worked when we played with the Dingo because it wasn't the same kind of like raucous party vibe that I was going for. So, so that became a Nonnet chart. That's not on the record, but it's a regular in the rotation. But arranging is a little bit different, and sometimes, but to me, it's just about being in that space and just exploring the possibilities. But a lot of it is just sit down and you got to come up with something. You got 2 hours, so you better write.
Yeah. And you mentioned the War of Art. Like that book was really influential for me as well, and as were his sequels. I don't know if you've checked those out, but
No,
the
I gotta
Artist
check it out.
Journey. He's got one called The Artist Journey and another one called Do the Work. But those books have been really inspirational to me as well. And yeah, I like the idea that it's not necessarily about completing the thing. You don't have to sit there and do something genius, but you do got to show up. Most of the battle is just sitting there and showing up and just beating that resistance. And whether you get 1 bar or whether you write an entire tune, just showing up to work is really what matters. And I think a lot of people have a misconception about music and about art in general, which is that it's something that spontaneously happens. And it maybe some people describe their process as that, but it sounds like for you that the routine really matters, that it's something that you can kind of clock in and clock out. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I think the idea that maybe the muse will appear, but you have to be at work. You know what I'm saying?
You got to be at the desk.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I'll have ideas that are just suddenly spring to me, and it's like, oh, that's where it is. But a lot of the time, it's about building something. It's like, let me take this from this thing and blend it in with this from this other thing, or like, what happens if I put these two things together, or what if I have this like. Sometimes I'll use like for inspiration, I'll use like just who knows, like it could be anything in life, but it could be like an interesting story from somebody. I wrote a record on Lord Timothy Dexter, who was an eccentric, it was an eccentric character from the 1800s in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Or like, I wrote a lot of music about like fantastical creatures and things like that, just because
like the dingo neck is a mythical creature, right?
Yeah, is a cryptid. It's like a jungle. It's like a mysterious jungle walrus from the Congo or something like that. It's like that kind of thing. But once you have an idea, then it's just about sitting down and trying to work it out. I will say everybody that I talk to. So one of the benefits of doing Jazztopia podcast, for those listening, check it out. Is that I'm talking to all these different creative people, and it gives. I haven't met anybody so far. Now I've got a long way to go, and I'm sure I will. Okay, I'm sure I will meet somebody who does. I don't know anybody who just, I just spontaneously will write, and then it comes out, and then that's the final product. I wake up in the middle of the night, and I have this full idea, and then you write. Sometimes you do. I mean, sometimes that is the case, but the writing process, I feel like most of the time is like, well, I have a deadline. And I have to have the music done by the deadline, so I better write some new music. Okay, we got a record date coming up. We got to finish the music, or we're not going to have any music to write. We
got some money on the line here,
right? Yeah, exactly, or whatever. It could be anything, but so I'm very surprised by the fact that every individual artist has an individual approach to their work. Workflow or whatever. Yeah. And everybody's coming at it from different angles. And some people do, like, I figured it was commonplace to write every day, for composers and things like that. But very often it's just like they just hang out until they have a performance coming up, and then you got to finish the music before that. But for me, if I'm really trying to finish stuff, I try to set out a certain amount of time every day to just write. And it could be terrible. I could come up with nothing, or it could be cool.
It's great. I got a couple questions. So
Shoot.
I'm going to do this a little bit rapid fire style. We're going to tie this thing up.
Sure.
So the first one is, what's something that you wish you had figured out earlier in your musical career? What's something that if you could go back and tell yourself at, say, 22, 23, whatever age, something that you wish you knew back then that you know now?
I'm not sure if this is exactly the right answer, but I will say that the best advice I could give myself back then would be that no one is going to pull you out of obscurity and make you a musician. We are in control of our own fates, and you have to make it happen. You just have to create things. Your job is just to create things, and it doesn't matter whether anybody likes it at any given time. It's just that you are in control of your own fate, and just make something. Just make a band. Get your friends together and play. I was used to that back then, so I can't say that it was necessarily like I wasn't off of that path. It's not like, let me correct my path or whatever. But it is the best advice I could give myself in the past is like, you have the power to just invent your own reality, and you got to just do that. Just do it. Just write some music, because that's another funny thing about being in New York is like so often it's just like, oh, well, the people who we know that have like famous bands or whatever, they just put a band together and it worked. They just kept doing it. You know what I mean? It's just the invention of just do it. You just start doing it.
Yeah, when I see you and I think of you, like that's what I think of as somebody who is not just somebody who's really talented and somebody who's really dedicated to their craft, but also a doer. Like you're somebody who makes stuff happen. You put together bands. I've played in your groups. You call me for some wild electric thing, or you put together a jam session, or I've played with you in a bunch of different contexts at this point. But you're just somebody who seems to have your hands kind of busy doing things and making things constantly. Be it the podcast, be it your school, your educational school, which we can talk about in a little bit. Your lessons, your YouTube channel, the different bands. You've released several records in the last few years. Like it's really admirable, and it's something that I think you're really good at.
Thanks.
Sure.
In the middle of it, it feels it always feels like there's more stuff to do. You know what I
Sure.
mean? Or that I could be better about being quicker about it. Just like if I have an idea, just all right, get it done right now. Don't wait 6 months, you know. But I have all these things ruminating, and eventually I'll do them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I do think that I mean, you could be a genius, and if you don't do anything, it doesn't matter. You know, if people can't hear your music, you're a genius by yourself.
Right.
Or you can be like, okay. I mean, I don't know how many people like, I'm not the greatest trumpet player in New York. You know what I mean? It's hard. That's a high bar. But you could, if you just keep doing stuff, hopefully, you know, it works out.
Like I you know that quote from Bill Evans. I don't know if you've seen this interview where he says, you know, at a certain point when I was young, I just decided I was going to really take care of the music, and I'm just going to shut myself in the apartment and work really, really hard and get really good at the music. And at a certain point, somebody's going to open that closet and say, "Hey, you're good enough. We're looking for you." And I think that's pretty good advice, to put your head down and just really focus on what's important. But I think in 2021, especially in New York City right now, there's just so many incredible musicians. And with the social media game and all these different ways to accumulate attention, if you're not out there putting yourself out there, even if it's just going out and seeing music and being on the scene, you don't necessarily have to do social media. But in some ways you don't exist. I think it's really difficult to, unless you're Bill Evans,
Right.
to have somebody grab you by the hand and say, "Hey, you're coming with us, like we're going to the top."
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, I can't speak to this because I've only been in the music industry for, you know, I guess a decade, if you want to call it what I've been doing in the music industry, whatever. But it's also, yeah, the environment is totally different, where you don't have like a John Hammond appear at your gig and be like, "Oh, we're gonna sign. Come on, you're on Columbia Records."
Yeah,
now.
like what's the A&R like for these jazz labels? You know, like are there really people going out there and signing people? Is there even money for that?
There's no money for that. There's a little money, but
Sure.
not really. You basically have to fund the whole thing yourself. So, you know, I think about it though, because I don't know how many musicians I just absolutely love that basically would have been incompetent except for just playing, just amazing musicians. You know, how many people are like, how many people just I absolutely love were like borderline insane and just were killing. And somebody was able to be like, "It's cool. We're going to record the album. You put the band together and write the tunes, and then we'll put out the records or whatever." Like, we don't have that anymore. So I don't know how many people nowadays are like just absolute crusher musicians, but just are like, because musicians are such a wide range of people. Like, anybody in this world knows it. But like, you could have somebody who lives in a closet who like only eats ramen and like just plays the saxophone all the time. You know what I mean? Just chaotic people, which is awesome. But it's, you know, I want those people to have a record deal, man. You know, I want to hear their music.
Hear them, yeah.
Right, but sometimes, but I mean, so it's kind of a double-edged sword or something. Like, I wish it was easier for people to get access to, you know, without having to do this whole social media grind or stuff that, you know, we're not promoters. Musicians are not business people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not the same thing. It's a different job. You can learn to do it, and you should learn to do it because it's important.
Make your life easier.
It makes your life, well, you can do anything. You can do something. You know what I mean? But there aren't record labels really in the same way that there used to be with a ton of money that are just trying to find the next big thing or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm sure that exists in some form, but yeah, there's no way around. Oh, this has been really long. This is the longest winded rapid fire question that but you know,
That's true.
I mean, that's the deal. It's just like, you got to do a lot of stuff yourself, and that's the nature of the music industry.
Next rapid fire question.
Sure, I'll try to keep this
Next
short.
15-minute rapid fire
Exactly.
discussion. What do you think has been your biggest failure in music? Like, what's something that you look back on and say, you know what, that was a real lesson? Something that didn't go the way you planned, and then you learned something from it.
Man, my greatest musical failure, I would say, this is going to be very slow, Steve. We're going to have to, no, I don't know. I don't know if I can pinpoint anything that's been a real mess. And furthermore, failure is always a lesson. There's always a lesson to be learned from failure.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I've been righting the ship as I go, little by little. There's a lot of little failures, but none of them will make good stories. The one thing that I would say is maybe something, well, I'm not really the kind of person that would, it's just like catering to other people's whims or whatever. I'm not trying to put myself in a position where I'm like, catering to the interests of other people or whatever. But I would say there have been instances in which I say like, okay, let me create something that's going to be palatable to people. And time again, I learned that like you need to be true to your own musical vision, because that's where you're really going to bring out, it's almost like sometimes you don't realize that what you're doing is a reflection of yourself, but that's the stuff that people I think tend to resonate with the most. So stuff where I've been like, let me do this because this is going to be lucrative, is neither lucrative nor artistically fulfilling. That's not weddings and stuff. Like, you got to play weddings or whatever. You got to do the jobs, but like music that it's better to just follow your intuition. But I don't have...
Yeah, to not pander.
Yeah, just stick to what it is that you wanted. If you want to play free brass Ethiopian music or whatever, like, do that, and it's fine, But I haven't really crashed and burned. I would say I probably I should have learned to read better in the beginning. Before I came to New York, I should have learned to read better. That might have been a failure at times. I probably just crashed and burned on gigs because I couldn't read well enough. So that's the best I got.
All right, great. Okay, we'll wrap this thing up. We're gonna play another tune, or we're gonna do some sort of free playing, right? Could you describe what we're about to do? What are we gonna do here?
Sure. So here's what I would like to do.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite things. This is not gonna be short either. Sorry. You have to edit this way down, Steve. It's gonna be very dull.
Not editing it.
So I have lived for a long time in the world of free improvisation, and I like the danger. I like to be put into a situation where you don't know what's going to happen. It could go any number of ways. But that to me is a very exciting part of playing music. So we're going to do something. We don't know what's going to happen. We could just start off with no foundation at all. But I think what would be fun is to give it just a little something that we can rely on, just a little background information from which we can create a piece. Sometimes I like to do that where you just have like one idea, and that one idea can then shape a piece so that you don't end up falling into your own free music cliches, free improvisational cliches or whatever. So one of the things I thought would be cool is if we take a mode, just a particular mode, and start from there and see what we do with it. So I'm taking the reins on this now. Okay, we'll do an Ethiopian mode called Ambasel, and we'll start with that as a foundation. That's the only thing that we have as a foundation, and from there we're just going to try to create some music with it.
Can you, for the musicians out there, can you briefly explain what this mode is?
Sure. So Ethiopian music is a really fascinating style of music for many different reasons, and the whole culture of Ethiopia is fascinating. But one of the things that I really learned, and it's why I sort of gravitate towards it, is it taught me about, in Western music, as music has sort of, let's say, modernized, we've just added more and more notes to the scales until we have like 12-tone music. But in Ethiopian music, there's only 5 notes in the modes. So a lot of the time, it's just the right notes that you're using. So a typical Ethiopian mode might be, if we do this for musicians, 1, flat 2, 4, flat 5, natural 6, 1. That's called Anchi Hoya. And so you get these very particular colors out of these, like just the right notes that you're using. So Ambasel is a sort of inversion of a different, let's say, pentatonic scale. But you'll hear it. They'll figure it out. But a lot of the stuff is really fun. It just gives you a different way to think about it, because you can't fall. The thing about jazz is, jazz music, we're taught all these licks and stuff, and it's easy to just play your own cliches all the time. So one of the things that I like about taking, let's say, modes that might be unfamiliar for people or other people in the band or myself, is that you can't fall back on your own cliches. You have to be honest. You have to play honestly. So sometimes it's fun to use those as a foundation, because you have to be creative within the limitations that you give yourself, rather than just falling back on these things that you've already done 1,500 times.
Right. Very good. Briefly, I got a little story. It reminds me of a quote from Jim Hall that I always really loved, which was, somebody, he's talking about free jazz, and somebody asked him, hey, why did you sort of avoid that whole scene coming up? Because he was a young guy coming up when that music was really emerging, and he never seemed to be interested in it. And so they asked him, what is it about free jazz? And he said, some people would think that for me it was just a little bit too out, or that the reason I didn't do it, it was a little bit too out. And he says, actually, for me, it was just a little bit. I found it to just be dull, because take a game like tennis, and this is him saying this. Take a game like tennis, where if you have two of the best tennis players in the world and they're out in the middle of a field just batting a ball back and forth, it's not interesting. But as soon as you put lines and rules and a judge to make rules, suddenly the game is very dynamic and very, very interesting. So in other words, just having that kind of restraint, having some sort of rule that you can then bump up against, and with your freedom and with your communication, add some sort of excitement to it. So that's not to say that free jazz needs that. I'm not making a commentary on free jazz myself, but
Sure.
yeah, just that it's an interesting approach to sort of start from somewhere.
Yeah, well, I'll make a brief comment on free jazz, which
Please.
is one of my favorite things.
Yeah.
Is there are times, and there have been many times when I've gone to see a band, and I'm like, man, they just played the same thing 3 times.
Yeah.
Because there is, and different performances may work or may not work, and sometimes I don't have the language to describe why they work or why they don't work. But if you listen to people that I think are let's say just my heroes in that music, oftentimes, even if it's fully improvised, they're creating a structure as they go. So it's not just a matter of just play anything you want. It's just that you now have more license. You no longer have, if you play a jam session and you're playing all the things you are, and in the middle you turn sideways and you go someplace and you make a quick left turn into someplace else, people don't like that so much, But if it's understood that you can do anything that you want, that we're creating something in real time, then, you can do anything you want. But it does create the responsibility in my mind of trying to stick to something or use something, build your own environment, rather than just, we'll just play everything at once or whatever. Because that can't, it's like all the colors at once are white or something like that, but you're not getting a contrast. You're just getting everything happening at once.
Right.
Whereas if you're really, like, if you listen to Ornette Coleman or Anthony Braxton or Albert Eiler or any of these people, like, or The Fringe is a good example. Like, there's an underlying structure that they're creating in the moment rather than it being just like free-for-all craziness. It's just that you now have to work somewhat democratically to find that in real time. Yeah.
And I think it should be said, like, we're both heavily influenced by free jazz. Like, I was lucky to be exposed to it when I was pretty young. You've explored it personally in a deeper way than I have, but I've always been fascinated by it, and I've been touched by it. There's something about that music at its best that is really sort of special. And when it's happening, it's not just something that's self-indulgent for the musicians. It certainly looks like a lot of fun for the musicians, but sometimes the audience isn't really a player in that equation. But seeing groups like The Fringe, the audience is very much a part of it. And I know that you have some stories about that, and maybe we can get into that in the next time you're on the show.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, that as an audience member, that music can be incredibly dynamic and incredibly evocative. And a big part of that comes from the audience being part of the equation in a very direct way.
Totally. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And it will really touch anybody if the music is good.
Yeah.
And the music can be good or it can be bad. You know what I mean? But it's high risk, high reward music. That's the thing. It's like when it works, it really works, and the energy is there and everybody comes with you. But there's nothing to rely on. You can't rely on the tune for 3 minutes in and then we're out, Yeah. If something goes sideways, you might be in it for a grueling, 15 minutes or whatever. So it's high risk, high reward, but that's how I like it.
There you go. So I got one final question for you before we go, which is, why do you play music?
Yeah, I really don't know. I don't know, Steve. Unfortunately, I wish I could give you a better answer, but to me, it seems like something that is in me that I have to. It's like I have to try to express certain things in the same way that we have conversations, in the same way that we have to, I don't know, in the same way that we have to have the communication between different people or whatever. It's something that I can't help. And so I would either have to embrace it as something that I do every day and I can try to make it my, life, or it's something that I'd just be thinking about while I was doing some other gig or whatever. So I don't have I really don't know, honestly, but it's something that I can't help but do.
That's great. And where can people find you online?
The best place is, let's see, Instagram is at Bob Spellman. That's the one I keep up to date the most.
Mm-hmm.
Facebook is Bobby Spellman Music, but I don't update that one. So you can find me there. My website is bobbyspellman.com. And then, but I'm every place. And you can check out Jazztopia at any place you get podcasts or on YouTube. And let's see. And then my music's wherever you get music. And if you want to buy an album, it'll help me get towards putting out another album someday.
Very good. Bobby Spellman, thank you so much. We're going to play a tune and then we're going to wrap it up. So
Right on.
thanks for being on the show.
Steve. Yeah, man.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for having me.